Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to join with you for this conference and to share some of my ideas about change, because I think that the capacity to bring about change in our society sometimes looks so daunting and so difficult that we give up. But it's my experience that there's always an opportunity, there's always a window of opportunity to bring about social change, and we need good politics, good science, good commitment to make that happen. And my central theme for today is that those of us that are interested in making sure that evidence has a role to play in policy need to consider the instruments of public participation that are used to support that evidence. And it's my considered conclusion that deliberative democracy as a particular technique can be very important in facilitating change in a society. But before I do that, I might just point out that having come all the way from Australia, it's incumbent upon me to tell you that there's a clause in the Australian Constitution that's directly taken from the Swiss Constitution. Back in the 1890s, when Australia was developing its own constitution, which went through the British Parliament and then was enacted as the basis of government in Australia, we had a federal system. And the big question was, well, how are we going to change this constitution and respect our federal system? And the constitution makers of the 1890s went across to Switzerland and came back with a clause which says you can only change the Australian constitution if you have a majority of votes over all and a majority of votes in a majority of states. Well, can I say to all the Swiss people here, that makes change very hard in Australia. But of course, that was the point of the exercise. But now, to the whole issue of our cities, the tremendous range of challenges that we have. There are big issues, more and more people living in cities. Some of them are highly car-dependent cities. We saw that recently illustrated in Houston, Texas, with the floods that went through and the sprawl that exists in that city and the difficulties that's created there. Getting social, economic and environmental determinants as part of the decision-making process is a big challenge. And finally, all cities need to deal with the marginalised, the vulnerable and the disadvantaged, and some of the measures needed to do that are highly controversial. So we've got lots of challenges. The big city planning challenges, the social and economic and environmental determinants challenge, and the controversial but necessary policy initiatives challenge. Now, when we look at what people tell us is a healthy city, you can see how complicated this political challenge becomes. I've only taken one example here from some American literature on what it would look like to live in a healthy city. It talks about, obviously, the public transport, the mixed use, buildings that are different, size, condition, type, living spaces everywhere that people can enjoy, public squares at significant intersections, people coming and going, street trees, rooftop gardens. My wife and I, Ingrid, spent 12 months in Amsterdam. We had a rooftop garden as part of the apartment that we had. All of these things are important. Your light rail, shops that are open to the sidewalk and not onto the parking lots, and of course working farms. Now, I just use this as one example of the sorts of things social scientists are telling us we need to do to build a healthy city. But look at all of those types of initiatives, and what you immediately see is the political challenge. First of all, NIMBYism, where if you want mixed use, mixed income, egalitarian communities, the middle class might say, no. We want this community for our people, our needs, our approach. And so a barrier is put up against changes that might improve the egalitarianism of a community. There's fundamentalists who come in and say, look, vulnerable people have made certain choices, that's their problem, not our problem. in terms of the philosophical and religious beliefs that may be held. And of course we now live in this strange world, an amazing shift where there's a very strong sentiment backed up in the higher circles of power in some parts of the world that all beliefs are equal. That you can hold a belief and it doesn't matter what the consequences of the application of that belief is, you hold it and no matter what, you're not going to vary it. And all beliefs are equal in this post-truth world. So we've got a complex set of issues we have to address, and we've got a lot of intellectual and political challenges attached to them. Traditional politics takes us so far. Traditional politics I call the Enlightenment equation. Leadership with some political nous, and we're going to hear from former President Ruth Dreyfus about the consensus building around a lot of the reform policies here in Switzerland. Political nous, elections, alliances formed in elections, and then Jerry gets his 5 minutes with the minister. The science comes in to try to build the policy basis on the basis of knowledge. Leadership, accountability and science equals progress. That's our model. It's not delivering enough. It's not delivering enough to enable us to tackle the big issues. So we do need reform, and it's my considered view that one way to assist the reform project is to introduce deliberative democracy as part of the equation that is public policy. Deliberative democracy is discussed by political scientists as an improvement on the way that we practice our democracy, and I agree with that. There's another way to look at it. It's a policy instrument that can be very useful in empowering those leaders to do things that otherwise they would not do. An assembly of citizens, demographically representative of the larger population, brought together to learn and deliberate on a topic in order to inform public opinion and decision making. Citizens' juries, consensus conferences, planning cells, deliberative polls and citizens' assemblies being examples. I won't go through the list, but there's a good summary of the types of things that you can do to incorporate randomly selected citizens into the decision-making process to improve upon the things that we do to ensure we have a sustainable community. 3 key concepts here: empowerment, moving beyond consultation; sharing power, representativeness, adding random sampling to the existing system of elections and referendums, getting a representative group of society and asking them to deal with an issue. I think the most interesting example in recent years was in Ireland, of course, where 2/3 randomly selected, 1/3 from the Parliament, devised a whole range of conclusions about how to improve the Irish Constitution, which along with the church, along with the banks and institutions and the political class had been really hit hard by scandal. And they came up with a set of conclusions that had to go to referendum and pass through the referendum process. But it was the power of the random selection that I think enabled those measures to be treated differently than if they just come out of the Parliament itself. And finally, there's deliberation. Swiss direct democracy, British parliamentary government that we have in Australia, for example, should work on a deliberative basis. But we all know factions, political parties are necessarily a part of that process, and sometimes it makes it very hard for people to deliberate. To deliberate requires you to listen. I remember, incidentally, when I was in politics, I brought in an expert in listening to talk to all of my team in the West Australian State Parliament. And you know what we found? Very few of my political colleagues listened at all. It went in this ear and went out the other without anything going on in between. Listening is a very, very powerful skill and capacity, and too often we don't do it properly. So we need these concepts to become more active in the way that we practice our democracy. It might be a very local issue. We were very privileged last night to do a short tour of some of the interesting hotspots of Swiss history here in Basel, with the drug policy, dealing with disadvantaged people. And we looked at some of the open spaces and how they'd been altered as a result of the influence perhaps of the middle class on the way in which the city operated to the disadvantage of the vulnerable. And it might be that some of these local issues that are intractable from a reform point of view might be assisted by using an assembly or a jury. There might be a new technology coming along that needs proper exploration. The Danes, of course, have been very good at this with their consensus conferences. It might be a major issue like the Constitution, as was the case in Ireland. Or it might be one of those wicked problems in a complex environment, for example, the challenge of city policy. Now, for the politicians in the room, we did research in Australia. I'm involved with a foundation, the New Democracy Foundation. We did intensive research on attitudes towards democracy, and we found that there was an appetite in the community for citizens' juries. There was a feeling that the political system wasn't working as well as it should. We all know that from the way politics is going in Europe as well. And 57% supported the idea of a citizen jury. Only 12% were against and 31% needed more convincing. I just mention that to remind you all that we've got to get opinion behind the things that we want to do. In New Democracy, we've done a number of initiatives with citizen juries and assemblies, water policy, local governments, nuclear fuel cycle. One of the governments wanted to introduce a major nuclear facility in South Australia, thought it was a good idea, couldn't quite get the support, had a citizen jury, and the citizens jury actually came out more against it than the Parliament. Infrastructure planning, obesity, obviously the whole movement of the EPOD movement in Europe, getting people involved in tackling obesity, cycling policy, transport nodes, safe and vibrant cities, energy policy and parliamentary reform. So these are the sorts of initiatives we've taken in Australia. There are many others from all over the world. I just mentioned one. My own government in 2003, in fact, there was a build-up of over 12 months' work before we got the final Citizens' Assembly in 2003, looking at the future of the city of Perth. Density very low, expanding suburbs. We needed to deal with this issue if we were to, for economic and social reasons. We had a whole range of initiatives. Finally, we had a randomly selected group, along with invited stakeholders and self-nominated people, to consider the plan for Perth. As a government, we agreed that whatever that assembly came up with, we would do. A lot of my colleagues were very nervous about that, actually passing power over to another group. They came up with some very considered views, which we incorporated into our city plan, structured around a public transport initiative, a significant public transport initiative. So it can work. What do we find? Participation goes beyond the usual suspects. The usual suspects, the people with a vested interest. You get a better policy conversation. Ironically, perhaps, when people are given, you trust people, they start to take on board the responsibility of that trust. You get good, actionable and defensible recommendations, which is good for the politicians. Public trust is increased. Just one example, in the city of Sydney, in the whole metropolitan Sydney, a number of years ago, one of the councils had a deliberative democracy budget. And they called it a participatory budget. You've probably heard the experience started, I think, in Brazil, has spread across many other jurisdictions, and they built their budget on the basis of the randomly selected group of citizens. The next election, all over Sydney, the Labor Party, which was my party, was absolutely demolished in the local elections because of a whole series of scandals. In this one jurisdiction, where the citizens had been involved in the budget, the vote for the Labor mayor went up. I think there's a bit of a lesson there about building trust, which is the necessary precondition for social change. So there are benefits, democratic and what I would call practical. I won't go through them, but think about deliberative democracy, not just in political science terms, not just in political philosophy terms. Think about it in terms of hard politics. You want something to happen. Increase your chances of making that happen by using a deliberation. So, my conclusion, put it in your kit bag. Countries like in Germany, the Netherlands, in many of the state jurisdictions in the USA, in Australia, in Canada, we've seen this initiative and it's been very effective. What we need, I think, is a new alliance. The Enlightenment alliance was between the scientists and the politicians. That alliance is important. We now need another alliance between the city reformers and the deliberative democrats to achieve a better city for all and not just some of the people that live within its boundaries. Thank you very much.